The alien warrior should have been dead. Her armor hung in shattered pieces, ceremonial warplate that had drunk starlight for centuries now split open like broken promises. Silver scales etched with constellation patterns lay scattered across black glass ground, each piece reflecting a sky that didn't belong to Earth. One shoulder was gone entirely, torn away by weapons designed to harvest rather than kill. Blue blood leaked down her side, iridescent and slow, pooling in the ash like liquid sapphire. But she stood, Seraph Kyle, captain of the Starborn Vanguard, warbound of the Kael'thar Covenant, kept one knee locked and the other barely holding. Her blade arm, that elegant fusion of bone and living metal her people were born with, hung broken at her side. The weapon that had carved through a dozen battlefields, now reduced to a jagged shard no longer than a dagger. Around her, 5 hunters circled with the patience of carrion birds who knew their meal was guaranteed. The Titan's Edge battlefield stretched silent in every direction. What had been a thriving lunar colony just hours ago was now a graveyard of melted infrastructure and cooling bodies. The morning sun of the planet below bled red through the thin atmosphere, turning everything the color of old wounds. Smoke drifted between broken hull plates and shattered defense towers, carrying the smell of burned ozone and extinguished lives. Seraph's tactical display had gone dark 20 minutes ago, when the last of her unit fell. 12 warriors under her command, each one trained since childhood, each one bonded to her through oaths older than human spaceflight. Now they were data points in a battle report no one would ever file. The hunters weren't military. Their armor told that story clearly. Patched with trophies, decorated with teeth from a dozen species, painted with kill tallies that would make regular soldiers vomit. These were collectors, professionals who made fortunes harvesting the exotic, the rare, the powerful. And a Kael'thar warbound captain, still breathing, was worth more than most colonies. The lead hunter raised his shock spear, the tip crackling with blue electricity. His voice carried through external speakers, distorted and amused. Kael'thar commander, your armor alone could buy a mining station. Your blade genetics, he laughed, the sound hollow inside his sealed helmet, priceless on the black market, makes this almost too easy. Seraph's fingers tightened on her broken blade shard. Her vision swam from blood loss, but her mind remained crystalline clear. The warrior's calculation ran automatically, mechanical as breathing. 5 targets, 2 carrying shock weapons, designed to paralyze without killing the merchandise. 3 with collection tools, surgical instruments meant to separate valuable parts from bodies that might still be conscious during the process. Her effective combat capability, maybe 30%. Her chance of taking them all, statistically 0. But Kael'thar did not kneel in death. Kormara Veshtal, she whispered in her native tongue. A warbound dies standing. This is the way. This has always been the way. She shifted her weight, preparing for the final rush that would take 2, maybe 3 of them with her. Not victory, just defiance. Just one last gesture proving that some things couldn't be harvested, only destroyed. The lead hunter drew back his shock spear, savoring the moment. Then the world turned white. An industrial foam canister burst midair between them, expanding into a spreading net of quick-hardening compound. It slapped across the hunter's helmet and weapon with the sound of a wet blanket hitting stone. The foam hardened instantly, sealing at his visor, locking his joints, turning him from predator to statue in half a heartbeat. The hunter stumbled, suddenly fighting his own equipment, clawing at his face with hands that wouldn't respond properly. Seraph's head snapped toward the source of the throw, a human, male, unarmored, wearing a civilian rescue contractor's jumpsuit that had seen better decades. He was already moving, sliding across the glassified ground like someone who understood exactly how foolish this was and had decided to do it anyway. His face was set in the expression of a man who'd made a terrible decision and would see it through regardless. In his hand, another canister. He threw a magnesium flare directly into the nearest hunter's visor. Red-white light washed across the battlefield, retina-burning intensity that turned shadows into knives. The hunter flinched, reflexes overriding training, and in that moment of blindness, everything changed. The human didn't stop running. He came straight at Seraph like she was the objective, the only thing that mattered, a rescue target instead of an alien warrior who'd killed more experienced soldiers than he'd probably ever met. He grabbed her wrist. His hand was warm against her cooling skin, calloused from tools rather than weapons, strong enough to support but not restrain. The touch carried no dominance, no claim of ownership, just contact, just connection. Can you walk? His voice cut through the chaos, direct and practical. No translator needed to understand the tone. Pure assessment, zero ceremony. Seraph stared at him. Her combat-trained mind tried to process what was happening and failed to find categories. Humans didn't walk toward Kyle Thar warriors. They negotiated from distance, fought from cover, or ran from threat. They didn't charge into active combat zones to grab the hand of someone who could snap their neck with casual effort. His eyes met hers, human brown against her violet glow, and she saw no fear there. Concern, yes. Urgency, absolutely. But not the terror that her kind usually inspired in his species. Can you walk? He repeated, already pulling her toward a ridge of twisted metal where shadows offered something resembling cover. Seraph tried to take a step. Her leg buckled immediately, muscles shredded by wounds she'd been ignoring through combat trance and sheer stubbornness. She pitched forward. The human caught her before she hit the ground, moving with reflexes that shouldn't have been fast enough. The impact drove air from his lungs in a grunt, but he held firm, taking her weight with the kind of whole-body mechanics that spoke of experience hauling things heavier than they looked. He was shocked by two things immediately: how light she felt under the armor fragments, her species built for speed and precision rather than mass, and how hot, like her blood was burning from the inside, her core temperature running degrees above human normal. A hunter lunged from the side, opportunistic and silent. The human didn't look. His peripheral vision caught the movement, and his body responded before conscious thought finished processing. He released Seraph's wrist and swung his heavy cutting tool in a brutal arc. No technique, just momentum and desperation. Metal met helmet with a sound like a bell being struck wrong. The hunter dropped, unconscious or dead. Neither of them had time to check. The human's hands vibrated from the impact, bones screaming protest up his arms. But he didn't drop the tool. He turned back to Seraph, and for the first time since the battle began, her expression shifted from pure tactical rage to something sharper. Confusion. A human. Unarmored, with no clan markings she could identify, no military designation, no reason to be here. Standing between her and death like it was a reasonable choice. Like species loyalty mattered less than the simple fact that someone was dying and he could maybe stop it. He pulled her arm over his shoulder with surprising gentleness given the circumstances. "Okay," he said, voice rough but steady. "Don't die on me. I'm not carrying you twice." The broken translator and Seraph's failing armor caught fragments, turned them into approximations. The meaning came through more in tone than words. "Stay alive. We move together. Don't quit on me." They moved. Not fast, not clean, but they moved. Behind them, the remaining hunters regrouped, their initial confidence replaced by rising anger. The ugly certainty that their prize was slipping away mixed with the professional calculation of how much effort a single human was worth versus the value of the merchandise. The human pulled Seraph through a corridor of twisted wreckage, using debris as shields, forcing their pursuers into narrow lines. When a hunter fired a pulse shot, he kicked a loose plate into the beam's path. The energy deflected into scorched ground. When another rushed them, he yanked a hanging cable and sent an engine casing swinging like a pendulum, catching the hunter mid-run with the inevitability of physics. Glass plane, junk maze, simple geometry turned into tactical advantage. Seraph watched through pain-blurred vision. This wasn't warrior combat. This was survivor thinking, using environment as weapon, turning every obstacle into opportunity. Unconventional, improvised, effective. They reached an emergency pod half buried under scrap metal, its hull rusted and pitted with age. One seat meant for solo evacuation. Not meant for two, barely meant for one. The human slammed the hatch open with his shoulder and pushed her inside first. No hesitation, no self-preservation calculation. Seraph resisted, grabbing his sleeve with sudden strength that surprised them both. Her fingers locked on the rough fabric with the grip of someone who'd spent their entire life being the protector, not the protected. someone for whom accepting help required rewiring fundamental identity. Her eyes searched his face, desperate and furious, trying to communicate across species and situation, trying to understand what kind of creature throws themselves into death for a stranger. Then she spoke. One word, harsh and musical, carrying weight that transcended translation. Seraph. She pressed her hand to her chest, the gesture unmistakable. Her name, her identity, the thing she was offering in exchange for this incomprehensible rescue. The human blinked, processing. Then understanding crossed his features, something almost like a smile. Cool, I'm Connor. He tapped his own chest. Connor Hayes. Seraph pressed 2 fingers to his sternum, hard enough to feel his heartbeat through the jumpsuit. The gesture was a question in her culture, a demand for acknowledgement, for witnessing. Connor held still, accepting the touch without flinching from its intensity. Connor Hayes, he repeated, slower, making sure she heard each syllable. Her pupils widened slightly, the violet glow flickering, like the sound mattered, like she was recording it into memory alongside combat data and tactical assessments. Outside, footsteps crunched closer across broken glass. The hunters had regrouped, spread into a search pattern, closing the net with professional efficiency. Connor shoved himself into the pod with Seraph, physics arguing against the possibility. Half on his knees, half twisted sideways, his spine bent at an angle that would hurt for weeks if they survived the next 5 minutes. The hatch wouldn't close. Not with both of them crammed inside a space meant for one. Warning lights blinked red across the ancient control panel. Pressure seals failing. Life support compromised. The pod was designed to keep a single person alive for a short emergency flight. 2 meant neither would make it. Connor's jaw tightened, mind racing through options that didn't exist. He grabbed the foam seal canister from his belt, the same industrial compound he'd used to blind the first hunter, smashed it against the hatch frame and sprayed the edges while forcing the door down with his shoulder, body weight, and desperation against mechanical resistance. The foam expanded, hardened, welded the seal shut. Messy, imperfect, held together by hope and chemistry. Airtight enough for a short run. Maybe. The pod rattled as weapons struck the outside. A shock spear slammed into the hull, denting metal, the impact resonating through the cramped space like being inside a struck drum. Seraph lifted her broken blade shard, the instinct to defend hardwired so deep that injury and exhaustion couldn't suppress it. Connor shook his head, placing his hand over hers, gently pushing the weapon down. No, if that opens even a crack, we're done. She stared at him like he'd insulted her honor, like he'd suggested a war-bound hide from threat. Her entire body language screamed protest, every muscle tensed against the idea of passivity while danger pressed close. Then her gaze flicked down, to his hands, scarred from years of technical work, to the foam seal, crude but functional, the kind of solution that shouldn't work but did, to the emergency welds holding the pod together through nothing but improvisation and refusal to accept failure. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition rather than trust. This human wasn't strong like a warrior. He was dangerous in a different way. The way of someone who survived by thinking faster than problems evolved, by turning every disadvantage into leverage. The pod shuddered again, another impact, closer to critical failure. Connor reached for the manual thruster lever, ancient mechanism that screamed liability in 3 languages. Hold on, he muttered, more to himself than her. His eyes caught the fuel readout. Critical. Almost empty. They had 1 burn, maybe 2 if he was creative and lucky. Fuel's critical, but if I dump life support reserves into the thrusters... He started rerouting systems with desperate speed, fingers flying across the interface. We get 1 burn, 1 chance at controlled descent instead of ballistic death. The pod shuddered as non-essential systems died, their power redirected to engines that coughed once before catching. He yanked the thruster lever. The pod lurched forward, scraping through wreckage with the sound of tortured metal. It smashed past broken plating, bounced off a support beam, and burst into open space with all the grace of a thrown brick. Behind them, the hunter's silhouettes shrank to black specks against the red horizon. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like they'd made it. Then the pod's console lit up with a message written in the universal language of imminent death. Fuel depleted. Trajectory unsafe. Life support compromised. Connor exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice through sheer stubbornness. Okay, he said quietly. New plan. Seraph's breathing grew rough, each inhale a visible effort. Her blood soaked into the pod's floor, pooling in corners, shimmering like spilled starlight under the emergency lighting. The iridescent blue looked beautiful in a way that made Connor's chest tight, because he knew what it meant. She was dying, slowly but certainly. And he had maybe 20 minutes to figure out how to stop it with equipment designed for human biology and hope that somehow translated. Her eyes stayed on him, not pleading. Kael'thar didn't beg, but watching, measuring, recording this human who'd pulled her from death and now sat in a failing, already planning their next impossible survival. Then, with effort that made her shoulders tremble, she reached up and touched the side of his face. The gesture was strange for a warrior, almost gentle. Her palm rested against his cheek, fingers cool despite her species' elevated temperature. Her touch carrying intention beyond comfort. She spoke again, several words this time, low and urgent, the sounds flowing like water over stone. The pod's dying translator caught fragments, struggled to parse grammar and context, finally spat out broken text across the cracked display screen. Chosen, bound, mate. Connor froze, his entire body going rigid with the sudden certainty that he'd missed something crucial. That cultural context he didn't understand was shifting beneath his feet like unstable ground. He looked at her, really looked, past the armor and the blood and the alien features. At the intensity in her eyes, the absolute conviction in her expression, the way she held his gaze like she was issuing a battlefield command that would reshape everything. What? His voice came out strangled. What did you just... Seraph's hand pressed firmer against his face, making sure he couldn't look away, couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. She spoke again, slower this time, each word deliberate. The translator had enough power left for one more attempt. Text scrolled across the screen, clearer now, terrible in its clarity. I claim you, life debt sealed, you are mine. Connor's mind went blank, then flooded with questions, protests, confusion that had no framework for processing what was happening. Outside the cracked viewport, the horizon tilted as the pod's trajectory degraded, and sliding out of the clouds above, silent and perfect, came ships, sleek vessels that drank light instead of reflecting it, their hulls covered in the same constellation patterns that had decorated Seraph's armor. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military formation, dozens of them, appearing from nowhere like they'd been waiting just beyond sight. Kael'thar warships, a full fleet response. They weren't chasing the pod. They were pacing it, matching velocity, waiting. Connor's mouth went dry, understanding, clicking into place with the weight of a death sentence. Those ships had responded to Seraph's distress beacon. They were coming for their commander, their war-bound captain, their warrior who represented something important enough to deploy fleet assets. And she had just claimed him, bound him, called him mate in front of whatever cultural framework her people operated under. He looked at Seraph, this powerful alien bleeding in his lap, who had just made him part of something that could get entire worlds burned. Seraph, he said carefully, voice tight, what exactly did you just do? She met his eyes, fierce and certain, her expression carrying zero regret. Saved you, she said, the translator finally catching up to real time. As you saved me. The pod screamed as it tore through the upper clouds, metal vibrating, warnings multiplying across every functional display. The moon rushed up to meet them, barren and hostile, its surface marked with impact craters and ancient ruins. Connor braced one hand against the wall and the other against Seraph's shoulder, keeping her stable as gravity twisted sideways and physics stopped making promises about their survival. The Kael'thar ships maintained formation above them, neither helping nor hindering, just watching with the patient inevitability of judgment, delayed but never forgotten. Connor had spent his entire adult life around danger. He'd worked disaster sites, pulled survivors from wrecks that should have been coffins, walked through situations where one wrong move meant death. He understood risk. He understood probability. But this was different. This wasn't mechanical failure or natural disaster or even hostile fire. This was cultural consequence, political ramification. The kind of danger that didn't kill you fast but reshaped your entire existence until you weren't sure which would have been preferable. The moon's surface filled the viewport, gray and unforgiving. "New plan," Connor said again, gripping Seraph tighter as impact approached. "We survive the next 60 seconds. Then we figure out what the hell you just dragged me into." Seraph's lips moved. Might have been a smile, might have been pain. Hard to tell with alien features and approaching unconsciousness. "Telkareth," she whispered. "Life bond. Kormara Veshtal." The translator gave up, too damaged to parse, but Connor heard the certainty in her tone. She'd claimed him, bound him, made him hers, and somewhere above them, a fleet of ships that could reduce planets to asteroids was waiting to see what humanity's newest and most unwilling diplomat would do about it. The pod hit the moon's surface at velocity that made mockery of safety ratings. Metal tore. Sparks burst like dying stars. They tumbled twice, the world spinning into chaos before slamming to rest against a ridge of ancient stone. Then silence fell like a held breath. Connor didn't move for a long moment. He waited for pain to arrive, for his body to inform him which parts were broken beyond immediate repair. When nothing screamed louder than bruised ribs and a dislocated shoulder that had popped back into place during the tumble, he exhaled carefully. He checked Seraph, still breathing, still unconscious, still dying at a rate he needed to address immediately, or none of the cultural complications would matter, because there'd be nothing left to complicate. "Welcome to nowhere," Connor said to the unresponsive alien warrior in his arms, his voice rough with adrenaline crash and dawning horror at what the next hours would bring. He kicked the hatch loose with effort that sent pain lancing through his leg. Cold air rushed in, thin and metallic, tasting of dust and ancient ice. The moon's atmosphere was barely thick enough to breathe, just sufficient to keep them alive while it slowly killed them. The sky stretched pale and empty above, the planet they'd fled hanging low on the horizon like a watching eye, and higher, almost invisible against the stars, the Kyle-Thar fleet maintained position, waiting, watching, judging what happened next. Connor hauled himself out of the pod, every muscle screaming protest. Then he turned and lifted Seraph carefully, grunting as he took her weight again, cradling her like she was precious rather than dangerous, like she was someone who deserved gentleness despite being able to kill him a dozen different ways even in her current condition. She leaned into him without resistance, head against his shoulder, unconscious trust from a warrior who'd spent her entire life being the strong one. That told him more than words ever could, showed him exactly how badly she was hurt, how close to the edge she'd come. He found shelter under a stone overhang not far from the crash site, a space that offered protection from the thin wind and direct line of sight to anyone approaching. His training kicked in, hands moving on autopilot born from too many disaster sites and emergency extractions. He cut away the damaged sections of her armor with his multi-tool, the ceremonial warplate that had protected her through countless battles now just weight that needed removal. Each piece came away reluctantly, as if the armor itself mourned its failure to keep her safe. Beneath the metal, her skin showed patterns he hadn't expected. Crystalline structures that pulsed faintly with internal light, running along her limbs and torso like circuitry, designed by something that understood both biology and art. The patterns flickered weakly, synchronized with her heartbeat, growing dimmer with each breath. Connor sealed the worst wounds with medical foam from his emergency kit, technology designed for human injuries applied to alien biology with the desperate hope that basic principles of stopping blood loss translated across evolution. He monitored her breathing with instruments meant for his species, watching readouts that made no sense and trying to extrapolate meaning from patterns. Her pulse was too fast, her skin too warm. Nothing lined up with human baselines. But she lived. That was enough, for now. Hours passed in fragile quiet, marked only by the slow movement of the planet across the sky and the occasional flicker of Seraph's bioluminescent patterns. Connor sat nearby, working on a section of the pod's communication array he'd salvaged, trying to jury-rig something that might let them signal for help without immediately painting a target on their position. His hands moved through familiar mechanical processes while his mind spun through implications. She'd claimed him. Whatever that meant, in Kyle-Thar culture, it carried weight. Enough weight that a fleet had responded. Enough weight that his life had just become infinitely more complicated than pulling people from wrecks and trying to stay invisible in a universe that ate the noticed. When Sarah finally woke, it wasn't with groaning or confusion. One moment unconscious, the next her eyes opened. Violet glow focusing immediately on Connor with the alertness of someone trained never to show vulnerability. She watched him in silence for several heartbeats. Not like prey, studying predator. Like judgment, assessing evidence. Connor kept working on the communication array, giving her space to orient, to remember, to decide how she wanted to handle waking up in shelter with a human who'd seen her helpless. "You could have left," Seraph said suddenly, her voice lower than before, steady despite the pain that must have been coursing through every nerve. The translator in her partially repaired armor had enough power to function now, turning her words into something Connor's ears could process. He paused his work but didn't look up. Yeah, could have. When the hunters fell, when the pod failed, humans retreat when odds turn against them. She stated it as fact, not accusation. Simple observation based on tactical profiles her people maintained on every species they encountered. Connor set down his multi-tool, finally meeting her gaze. "Some do," he admitted. She waited, the silence carrying expectation. Connor sighed, the sound carrying decades of complicated history. "My job is saving people who don't get saved. If I start choosing who deserves it, I stop being useful. Stop being me." Seraph considered that, her expression unreadable. "Then you knew I was dangerous." "Still are," Connor agreed, "yet you stayed." "Yeah," her gaze sharpened, intensity increasing. "Witoyom." Connor finally looked directly at her, and the honesty in his face carried the kind of weight that didn't need translation. "Because you were still fighting, because dying alone is the worst way to go, because walking away would have felt like cutting out part of myself." He paused. "And because sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same, and I got tired of always picking smart." That answer seemed to strike something deep inside her. Seraph shifted, wincing as damaged muscles protested, but she pushed herself upright despite his gesture of protest, sat facing him with the posture of someone who wouldn't be kept prone, wouldn't accept the vulnerability of lying down when serious words needed speaking. "You misunderstand my words earlier," she said carefully. Connor felt relief flood through him. "Good, because I was real confused about the whole mate thing. I claimed Talkareth, life bond. This is sacred law among my people." The relief evaporated. Connor opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Okay, going to need you to explain that because the translator gave me mate, and that seemed like a pretty big leap from thanks for the rescue." Seraph's expression remained serious, no hint of amusement at his discomfort. "When one saves a warbound on the edge of honorable death, when they intervene without thought of reward or claim of dominance, they become Talkareth. Bound by choice," she paused, making sure he understood. "By my choice." Connor's stomach dropped. "Bound how?" Her eyes didn't waver. "In all the ways that matter, protection, truth, loyalty, partnership." The word hung between them like a bridge neither had asked to cross. Connor let out a breath. "Okay, that's intense. But I didn't save you for that. I didn't save you for anything except—" "I know," Seraph interrupted, and there was something almost gentle in how she said it. "That is why it matters." That shut him up completely. She continued, voice calm but carrying enormous weight beneath the surface. "The Kyle Thar are not merely warriors. We are shields, symbols. If I return alone, wounded with my escort dead, the council will fracture. Hardliners will claim human aggression. Moderates will lose ground." Connor's stomach tightened as implications cascaded. "And if you don't return? The Iron Claw faction will crown a puppet leader. They will harvest my people's worlds for resources." Seraph's jaw set. "Then they will come for yours." Connor stared at her. "Why Earth? Why would they—" "Because humans survive," Seraph said simply, the observation carrying no judgment, just tactical assessment. "You adapt, you endure, you resist being owned or controlled. That makes you valuable allies." Her expression hardened. "Or threats that must be eliminated before you become problems." Connor laughed once, bitter sound without humor. "You should see our history. We're better at eliminating each other than anyone else manages." "I have seen your history," Seraph replied. "That is part of why I chose you." That word again, chose. Before Connor could respond, his salvage scanner chirped, soft warning, multiple heat signatures cresting the ridge in the distance, moving with tactical spacing. Not hunters, soldiers. Disciplined, armored, organized, and human. Connor's blood ran cold as recognition set in. He knew that formation pattern, had seen it during his brief military service years ago before he transferred to civilian rescue operations and tried to find meaning in saving rather than destroying. They followed me, he muttered, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Seraph was already on her feet, swaying but upright, broken blade appearing in her hand like she'd summoned it from nothing. Her bioluminescent patterns flared brighter, combat readiness overriding injury through sheer force of will. These are not raiders, she said, eyes narrowing as her own sensors parsed the approaching formation. They carry command frequency gear. Earth's standard military encryption. Connor felt something crack inside his chest, like the last piece of innocence finally breaking under the weight of evidence. No, he whispered, that doesn't make sense. I'm a civilian contractor. Why would... The soldiers approached in clean formation, weapons lowered but ready, visors reflecting the pale sky like mirrors designed to hide humanity behind. Their armor was new, well-maintained, marked with insignia Connor recognized from news broadcasts and government press releases. Terran Strategic Command, the people who decided Earth's official position on alien contact. The organization that technically had no jurisdiction over civilian contractors, but somehow always seemed to be around when things went wrong. Their leader raised one hand. The universal gesture for halt, for parley, for this doesn't have to get messy. A voice called through amplified speakers, carrying across the barren moon surface with uncomfortable clarity. Connor Hayes, by order of the Terran Strategic Authority, you are to surrender immediately. Connor stepped forward before Seraph could stop him, before she could position herself between him and the threat like her instincts were screaming she should. I'm a civilian, he shouted back, voice raw with betrayal and dawning understanding. A contractor. You don't have jurisdiction here. This is disputed territory. The soldier paused. Helmet turned slightly, like consulting with someone off-channel, receiving orders or confirmation or permission to speak truth that changed everything. Then the soldier said words Connor would never forget, delivered in the flat professional tone of someone reporting facts rather than consequences. You were never meant to survive the convoy ambush, Mr. Hayes. The truth hit harder than any physical blow, harder than the pod crash or the hunter's weapons or the certainty of death he'd faced on the battlefield. Because this was different. This was intentional. This was his own people, his own species, treating him like expendable ammunition in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Behind him, Seraph's grip tightened on her broken blade, the sound of living metal responding to her rage carrying clearly in the thin air. You were bait, she said quietly, voice iron, a spark to ignite conflict. Connor's hands curled into fists, knuckles white, every muscle trembling, with the effort of not screaming or collapsing or doing anything except standing upright while his worldview restructured itself around this new terrible center. The soldiers advanced, weapons still lowered but fingers resting on triggers, the international language of we'd prefer not to, but we absolutely will. Seraph stepped to Connor's side, not in front, not behind, beside. Equal positioning, partnership stance. You saved my life, she said, voice carrying certainty that cut through confusion and betrayal like blade through flesh. Now I will save yours. Connor glanced at her, seeing the determination in her alien features, the absolute conviction that transcended species and circumstance. You're in no shape to... I am warbound, Seraph interrupted, lifting her chin with fierce pride that injury and exhaustion couldn't diminish. And you are Talkareth, mine to protect, mine to defend. The first shot rang out, not aimed to kill. Warning fire kicked up dust 5 feet to Connor's left. The universal message of next one won't miss. And in that moment, humanity's quiet war, the one hidden beneath contracts and corporate speak and official denials, finally broke into the open where everyone could see exactly what his species was willing to do to maintain advantage. Seraph's blade caught the pale sunlight, broken but still sharp, still dangerous. Connor stood beside her, unarmed except for tools and stubborn refusal to keep being used. The soldiers closed in, and somewhere above, watching through sensors and tactical feeds, the Kyle Thar fleet waited to see what happened, when humans revealed their true nature to the warrior who just claimed one of them as her own. The choice had been made. The bond declared the consequences were coming. All that remained was seeing who survived to tell the story. The first shot was a promise written in scorched dust. Captain Brenna Cordell stood at the head of her tactical squad, weapon raised but not yet aimed to kill. Her armor caught the thin sunlight, reflecting it back in fragments that made her look less like a soldier and more like something mechanical. Something without the burden of conscience. "Stand down, Hayes," she called through external speakers. "This doesn't have to escalate." Connor recognized that voice. 3 years ago, they'd worked the same disaster relief operation on Ganymede Station, pulling survivors from collapsed mining tunnels while corporate lawyers argued over liability in orbit above. She'd been different then. Careful, compassionate, someone who actually gave a damn about the people they were supposed to protect. Whatever she'd become since then wore her face but spoke with someone else's words. "Escalate?" Connor's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "You sent me to die, Brenna, you knew. The whole convoy, the medical supplies, the rescue contract, all of it was theater." Cordell's helmet tilted slightly. Not denial, just assessment of how much he'd figured him out. Seraph shifted beside Connor, her broken blade catching light as she adjusted her stance. Every movement calculated, professional, the body language of someone who'd fought outnumbered and won too many times to fear bad odds. The crystalline patterns beneath her damaged armor pulsed brighter, responding to adrenaline or anger or whatever chemical cocktail her species used to prepare for violence. Blue light traced her limbs like circuit diagrams drawn in bioluminescent ink. "The KL-Thar female is a strategic asset," Cordell said, her tone flattening into pure military efficiency. "Command wants her intact. You're a complication we can't afford." "Asset." Seraph repeated the word, her translator turning it into something that carried all the contempt she felt. "You reduce warriors to merchandise, levs to leverage." "Everything's merchandise if it keeps Earth ahead of the curve," Cordell replied. No apology, no shame, just the cold mathematics of empire wearing a human face. Connor felt rage boil up, hot and sharp, cutting through the betrayal and fear. She's not property. She's a person who almost died because you people decided her death would be politically convenient. And her survival bonded to you creates different opportunities. Cordell's weapon raised fractionally, the movement carrying implicit threat. "Which is why you're going to step aside. Let us handle this professionally, and maybe live long enough to spend whatever they pay you or silence." Seraph looked at Connor then, not asking permission, asking understanding. Her violet eyes held a question that transcended language. "Do you stand with me? Or do you step aside when convenience demands it?" Connor had spent 32 years learning to survive by staying invisible, by not making waves, by being useful without being noticeable. Every instinct screamed at him to step aside, let the professionals handle things above his pay grade, go back to pulling people from wrecks instead of getting buried in political consequences. But he'd also spent those same years watching people in power make decisions that turned human beings into acceptable losses. Watch them smile while filing reports that reduced tragedy to acceptable percentages. He'd left NASA because they wanted him to sign off on safety violations. Left military service because orders stopped making moral sense. Kept leaving every time someone tried to make him complicit in treating people like numbers on balance sheets. He was so damn tired of leaving. Connor nodded once. Agreement. Solidarity. The kind of stupid loyalty that got people killed but occasionally changed the shape of history. Seraph inhaled, the sound carrying satisfaction and fierce approval. Then the air answered her. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, low and deep, like massive engines waking in the moon's core. Fine dust lifted into the atmosphere, hanging unnaturally still, suspended against physics by something that didn't care about Newton's laws. The soldiers froze, training overridden by the primal human instinct that recognized predators too large to fight. Seraph drove her broken blade into the rocky ground. Light erupted, not explosion, not violence. Release, like she'd punctured something that had been building pressure 4 centuries, waiting for someone who remembered the old languages, the old oaths, the old ways of commanding reality through will and blood right. Veins of pale violet energy spread outward in a perfect circle, carving symbols into stone and soil. geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly because they existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. The symbols weren't written. They were remembered. By the moon, by the ancient machinery sleeping kilometers below, by technology so old that human civilization was barely a footnote in its operational timeline. Every electronic system in the soldier's armor screamed and died. Targeting arrays went dark. Communications dissolved into static. Heads-up displays flickered once and surrendered, leaving 8 highly trained operatives suddenly blind inside their helmets, reduced to looking through manual viewports like their ancestors had done before technology promised to make warfare clean. Connor stumbled back, his heart hammering. What? What did you just do? Seraph straightened fully, blood still leaking from partially healed wounds, but posture transforming from injured survivor to something ancient and terrible. The bioluminescent patterns across her skin blazed bright enough to cast shadows, networked to the energy flowing through the ground, turning her into a living conduit. But her legs trembled, hidden beneath her stance, but Connor saw it. She was burning through reserves she didn't have, buying seconds at the cost of hours of recovery. Blood seeped fresh from partially healed wounds. The node's power demanding payment in her own vitality. 30 seconds, she whispered to Connor, voice tight with strain. Then I collapse. Make them count. I called my oath, she said aloud, voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the symbol spreading across the moon's surface. This place remembers Kael'Thar's sovereignty, remembers when my ancestors walked here, built here, died here, defending what they loved. She raised one hand. The gesture looked casual. The effect was not. The nearest soldier's armor locked. Joints froze mid-step, servos fighting against forces that rewrote local gravity to suit convenience rather than physics. He collapsed to his knees, unable to move, eyes wide with terror behind his visor. The others staggered, suddenly carrying a weight that hadn't existed a moment before. Their armor transformed from tactical advantage to crushing liability. Cordell fought to raise her weapon, muscles straining against the pressure pushing down on her shoulders. What is this? This moon lies above a buried node, Seraph explained, voice calm despite the tremor in her frame, carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to slow students. Ancient technology, forgotten by most. But my people remember. We always remember our sacred places. Another gesture, another soldier dropped, armor clicking as joints locked in position, as the sophisticated machinery meant to enhance human capability turned into a prison of the user's own making. Your kind builds machines, Seraph continued, stepping forward with the slow inevitability of rising tide. Mine remembers places, knows how to ask them for old favors, old debts. Connor stared, not at the soldiers, but at Seraph. This was power far beyond battlefield prowess. Not brute force, not superior technology, control, precision, authority written into the fabric of reality itself by civilizations that had mastered stellar engineering, while humanity was still figuring out fire. This was what Earth feared, what they tried to manipulate and harvest and contain through schemes and expendable contractors. This was why they'd been willing to sacrifice him. Sacrifice Seraph. Sacrifice anyone necessary to understand and control what the Kael'Thar represented. Power that didn't care about human ambition. Seraph's blade flashed up, positioning herself as shield between Connor and the soldiers, her stance declaring his protection non-negotiable. You saved my life, she said, voice carrying certainty that cut through confusion and betrayal like blade through flesh. Now I will save yours. Connor snapped back into motion, instinct overriding awe. Then we move. Now, he moved toward the paralyzed soldiers, hands already reaching for their equipment, not their weapons, their systems. Cordell's eyes tracked him with mounting horror as understanding clicked. Hayes, don't what? Connor pulled the battery pack from her armor with practiced efficiency. Don't take your toys. Don't level the field. Don't make it harder for you to hunt us when your equipment's stripped. He worked fast, yanking data chips from tactical computers, pulling communication modules, removing anything that could track or coordinate or call for backup. Years of rescue work had taught him exactly how military hardware connected, exactly which components were critical, exactly how to reduce sophisticated killing machines to expensive metal shells. A younger soldier, barely out of training from the looks of him, watched Connor work with desperate eyes visible through his visor. "They'll kill us if we fail this mission," the soldier said, voice breaking. "Command doesn't tolerate." Connor paused. Did something unexpected. He pulled the soldier's data chip, but left his emergency beacon active. "When your armor unlocks, call for extraction. Tell them you were overpowered by alien technology." Connor met the soldier's eyes. "Or tell them truth, that you questioned orders and chose differently. Your call." The soldier's expression shifted. Not gratitude, understanding. The recognition that choice existed even in military hierarchy. Connor moved to the next soldier, continuing his methodical dismantling. Seraph maintained her stance, hand raised, concentration visible in every line of her body. The violet light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing slightly dimmer with each beat. She was burning through reserves she didn't have, holding control through will alone, the price mounting with every second. Connor finished stripping the last soldier and grabbed Seraph's arm. "Let it go. We need to move before you collapse." She released the connection reluctantly, the light fading, the symbols carved into stone going dark. The soldiers remained paralyzed by locked armor, but they'd recover. Eventually. Enough time to run, but not enough to feel safe. They moved deeper into the rocky valleys, putting distance between themselves and the disabled squad. Connor guided them through terrain that offered cover, his training cataloging sight lines and escape routes automatically. When they were a click away, sheltered in a narrow canyon that sensor sweeps would struggle to penetrate, Connor pulled out one of the data chips he'd grabbed, plugged it into his wrist computer, the salvaged civilian tech just compatible enough with military encryption to read basic files. What he saw made his stomach drop through the floor and keep falling. Project Catalyst. His name. Seraph's designation. Everything. The file opened with clinical efficiency, laying out the operation in bullet points and probability matrices, reducing human lives and political consequences to acceptable risk calculations. Connor read in silence, his hands starting to shake. Earth Strategic Command had known about the KLTHAR, had known about the buried nodes scattered across disputed space, had known about the political fracture inside the Covenant, the hardliners versus moderates, the delicate balance that could tip into civil war with the right pressure. They'd identified Seraph as Kormara, warbound commander, only heir to the Starborn Covenant's leadership structure. Her death or her bonding to a human, either outcome served Earth's interests. If she died, the hardliners would have their martyr, would push for human eradication, would trigger a war Earth had been preparing for, where conflict meant access to KLTHAR technology through salvage rights in conquered territory. If she survived and bonded to a human, it would destabilize Covenant politics, create fractures, opportunities, ways to drive wedges into alien society and expand Earth's influence through cultural contamination rather than open warfare. Connor had been chosen specifically. Whistleblower history meant he was already considered politically unreliable, expendable if things went wrong. His financial desperation after losing his NASA position meant he'd take contracts others wouldn't. His technical skills meant he might actually succeed at keeping Seraph alive through the initial contact. Perfect bait, perfect catalyst, perfect acceptable loss if the plan collapsed. The convoy had been set up from the beginning. The Scourge Raiders paid to attack at specific coordinates, specific timing. The hunters briefed on Seraph's location. Everything choreographed to create the exact scenario that would force a human to make a choice. Save the alien or stay safe. Earth had gambled that Connor's documented pattern of choosing moral action over self-preservation would override survival instinct. They'd gambled correctly, and they'd done it while marking him for termination the moment he served his purpose. "I was bait," Connor said aloud, voice hollow. "They knew exactly who I was, what I'd do. They weaponized my own conscience against me." Seraph moved beside him, reading over his shoulder, her translator parsing the military documentation. Her expression hardened into something cold and ancient as the full scope became clear. "And my people knew," she said softly. "The Council. They had intelligence about Earth's plans. They voted 4-3 to let it proceed." Connor looked at her sharply. "What?" "They believed my death would unify the Covenant. End the political debates through martyrdom. Sacrifice one warrior to prevent civil war. Her voice carried bitterness that cut like shattered glass. I was declared acceptable loss by my own leaders. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Both governments had known, both had planned. Both had been willing to let their own people die to achieve political objectives hidden beneath layers of strategic justification. They used us, Connor said. Both sides. We weren't people to them. We were chess pieces. Seraph's jaw clenched, and you broke both their games by refusing to follow the script. Connor laughed, sharp and bitter. Yeah, and now they'll both want us dead to cover the evidence. He pulled up more files documenting the conspiracy's depth. Financial trails showing corporate backers, weapons manufacturers who'd profit from either war or destabilization. Communication logs between Earth and Kael'thar faction leaders, the hardliners on both sides coordinating to create the exact crisis that would justify their preferred solutions. It was massive, sophisticated, the kind of conspiracy that required cooperation at the highest levels of government and military command, the kind that made whistleblowers disappear. Connor looked at the data chip in his hand, then at Seraph. I have an idea, he said slowly. Terrible idea, probably gets us both killed, but it's the most human solution I can think of. Seraph studied his expression, seeing the calculation happening behind his eyes, the moral mathematics of someone deciding which rules to break. Human ideas are usually terrible, she observed, but they work more often than they should. What do you propose? Connor pulled up his wrist computer's communication interface, started configuring broadcast parameters that would turn his civilian equipment into an improvised transmission array. We expose everything, publicly. Make it impossible for either side to cover up. They will hunt us for this. They're already hunting us. Connor started uploading files, encrypting them for burst transmission across every frequency he could access. But if this goes public, we stop being convenient victims. We become witnesses, evidence, the thing they have to discredit instead of quietly eliminate. Seraph considered, tactical mind running probability scenarios. Then something like approval crossed her alien features. You fight by changing the battlefield, by making the hidden visible. It's what I'm good at, Connor admitted. Got me fired from NASA. Got me blacklisted from half the contractors in the solar system. Might as well use it for something that matters. He finished the upload configuration, fingers flying across the interface with the speed of someone who'd done similar work before, who understood exactly how to bypass security protocols and route signals through relay networks that couldn't be easily traced or shut down. When I trigger this, every news network, every civilian channel, every military band that isn't actively encrypted will get the files. Earth media, Kael'thar monitoring stations, everyone. They will consider this act of war. They already committed acts of war. I'm just filing the report they didn't want written. Connor looked at her directly. This is your fight too. Your people wanted you dead. You get a say in whether we do this. Seraph reached out and placed her hand over his on the interface. The gesture of partnership, of shared consequence. Expose them, she said. Both sides. Let truth be the weapon they never planned for. Connor triggered the broadcast. Data exploded outward across every available frequency. Compressed files expanding as they hit relay stations. Civilian networks. Even hijacking emergency broadcast systems designed for natural disasters and turning them into channels for deliberate revelation. Project Catalyst. The conspiracy, the names, dates, financial trails, communication logs, everything. Within seconds, Connor's wrist computer started showing response pings. News organizations picking up the signal. Military channels going active with confused chatter. Civilian forums lighting up with shocked speculation. The secret was out, spreading, replicating across networks faster than any containment could suppress. Cordell's voice cut through on the military band, no longer professional, pure fury now. Hayes, you just signed your death warrant. Connor responded calmly, broadcasting on the same frequency so anyone monitoring would hear. No, Captain, I just made it too expensive to kill me quietly. Now everyone's watching. Now it matters. He cut the connection. Seraph's tactical sensors pinged urgent warning. The Kael'thar fleet, they're moving. Coming here. Connor looked up. The sky, pale and empty moments before, now showed dark shapes descending through the thin atmosphere. Dozens of ships, elegant and terrifying, their hulls drinking light as they approached. The response was faster than he'd expected. Faster than should have been possible unless they'd been waiting, watching, prepared to intervene the moment circumstances demanded it. Seraph closed her eyes briefly, some internal sense activating, reading signals Connor couldn't perceive. They felt my oath, she said. When I activated the node, the energy signature broadcast through the network. Every Kyle-Thar vessel with proper sensors knows a warbound called ancient power, and they'll want to know why. They will demand to know why I bound myself to a human. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. My people will not be pleased. The ship settled onto the moon's surface with the coordinated precision of military formation. Not aggressive deployment, controlled arrival. The difference between attack and judgment. A ramp extended from the nearest vessel, massive and ornate, decorated with the same constellation patterns that marked Seraph's armor. Figures emerged, tall, marmored in layered plates that shifted color as they moved, each one radiating the controlled danger of professional warriors. At their center walked an older Keshilthar female. Her armor was simpler than the others, darker, marked with symbols worn smooth by time and repeated use. Her eyes glowed not bright violet like Seraph's, but a deep indigo, calm, heavy, ancient in a way that transcended simple age. Seraph immediately dropped to one knee, the gesture automatic, drilled by culture and training too deep to question even in current circumstances. High Arbiter Ryson, she said formally. I return wounded but unbroken. Connor's instincts screamed at him to kneel as well, to show deference to obvious authority, to make himself small and unthreatening. He didn't. He remained standing, not defiant, just present, witness rather than supplicant. Ryson's gaze slid to him immediately, assessing with the kind of attention that felt like being dissected by someone who understood anatomy well enough to kill or heal with equal precision. A human, unarmed, standing while others kneel. Interesting. Her voice carried without effort, each word precisely shaped, the kind of speaker who never needed to raise volume because command existed in cadence and certainty rather than force. Connor cleared his throat. Ma'am, a ripple moved through the gathered Keshilthar warriors. Not laughter, something else. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that this human at least understood basic respect, even if he chose not to perform expected submission. Seraph looked at Connor, surprise flickering across her features, then something that might have been approval. Ryson stepped closer, movement graceful despite the armor's weight, stopping just beyond striking distance. You smell of metal and fear, she observed. Yet you stand. Why mine? Connor considered several diplomatic answers, things that might smooth this interaction toward peaceful resolution. Then decided honesty had worked so far, might as well continue the pattern. Because kneeling felt wrong, he said simply. Because I don't know your customs well enough to fake respect, and real respect shouldn't require performance. Many creatures do foolish things when frightened, Ryson replied. That does not make them worthy of notice. I'm not looking for notice. I'm looking to keep my friend alive. Connor gestured towards Seraph. Everything else is negotiable. Ryson's expression shifted fractionally. Then she turned her full attention to Seraph. You invoked Talkareth. You claimed bond with this human. Explain. Seraph straightened but remained kneeling, the posture of someone showing respect while preparing to defend what mattered. He saved my life when retreat was logical. When survival advised abandoning me to honorable death, he chose intervention. Fought without seeking dominance. Protected without demanding reward. Many species show mercy when it costs nothing, Ryson countered. It cost him everything, Seraph said flatly. His people marked him for death, used him as bait. He knew, and still he stood with me when his own military came to finish what the hunters started. Ryson's eyes narrowed. You claim he chose you over his species? I claim he followed principle despite personal cost, Seraph replied, voice carrying absolute conviction. I claim Talkareth because he earned it, because he is worthy. Silence fell across the landing site, heavy with implication. Ryson studied Connor again, longer this time, reading things he couldn't begin to guess. Did you know what she was? the Arbiter asked him directly. When you intervened, did you know her rank, her importance, her political value? No, ma'am, Connor answered honestly. Just knew she was dying. And if you had known? Connor met the ancient indigo gaze without flinching. Still wouldn't have left her. The Arbiter's expression remained unreadable, but something in the air shifted. Not acceptance. Consideration. Before Rysen could respond, Connor's wrist computer vibrated sharply. Multiple alerts, jump signatures, new vessels entering local space. Human ships, angular and aggressive. Weapons hot. They tore into orbit with the subtlety of declarations of war. Military cruisers that made no attempt at diplomatic approach. No hesitation, no peaceful overture. A voice boomed across open channels, amplified to ensure everyone heard, human and alien alike. This is Terran's strategic command. The alien entity designated Seraph Kyle is to be surrendered immediately. Non-compliance will be met with appropriate force. Rysen's expression hardened into something cold and absolutely lethal. So, she said softly, the quiet more terrifying than any shout. This is your people's answer. This is how humanity negotiates. Connor stepped forward before anyone could stop him, before the moment crystallized into inevitability. No, he said loudly, that's how some humans negotiate, the ones who sent me to die, the ones who wanted this exact scenario. He pulled up his wrist computer, showed the broadcast data still streaming across networks. I exposed them, their conspiracy, their manipulation of both our species. Everyone knows now, Earth media, your monitoring stations, everyone. The first warning shot from orbit struck a distant ridge, vaporizing stone with casual display of overwhelming firepower. Kael'thar warriors raised weapons instantly, the coordinated response of soldiers who trained together for decades. Seraph's blade flashed up, positioning herself as shield between Connor and the threat, her stance declaring his protection non-negotiable despite her wounds. No, Connor said firmly, placing a hand on her arm. Not like this. Or she looked at him, violet eyes burning. They will kill you. Only if I let them choose the battlefield, Connor replied. He turned to Rysen, the terrible gamble forming in his mind. Your people value trials, judgment, truth spoken where all can witness. That's what Seraph told me. Yes, Rysen said slowly. Then let me speak, Connor said. Open channel, full broadcast, let me address them. They will use your words against you, or I'll use their response to prove exactly who's lying. Connor's jaw set. Give me voice, Arbiter. Let me be the problem they didn't plan for. Rysen studied him for a long moment, calculating, measuring, deciding if this human was brave or simply too ignorant to understand the danger. Then she gestured. A sphere of light formed in the air between them, projecting Connor's image across open space. In orbit, human commanders appeared in turn, faces hard and controlled, already computing damage mitigation and acceptable losses. Connor took a breath. This is Connor Hayes, he began, voice steady despite the fear trying to crawl up his throat. Civilian rescue contractor, expendable asset apparently. I'm broadcasting evidence that both Earth and Kael'thar governments staged this entire scenario. They wanted war, or they wanted destabilization. They got neither. They got something else instead. Data began streaming from his wrist computer into the shared projection, files appearing faster than censorship could suppress. You sent me to die to trigger a conflict. You marked an alien warrior for sacrifice to justify genocide. Both sides played the same game, just with different endgames. Admiral's face appeared in the projection, expression tight with barely controlled fury. You are ordered to... I don't take orders from people who marked me for execution, Connor interrupted. Not anymore. He looked directly into the projection, speaking not to admirals, but to everyone watching across both species networks. You don't want Seraph. You want what her people protect. Technology you don't understand, power you can't control. You're willing to burn bridges and sacrifice lives to get it. He gestured to where Seraph stood beside him. But here's the problem with your plan. I survived, she survived, and we both chose something you didn't account for. We chose each other over your manipulations. We chose truth over your convenient lies. The Kyle-Thar ships began moving above them, breaking from holding position, weapons coming online with the subtle hum of technology that could reduce moons to asteroids. Raisen's voice joined Connor's broadcast, cold and absolute. Withdraw your vessels, now, or face consequences not written by your strategist. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then one human ship powered down weapons. Then another. The Admiral's image flickered, his jaw working like he was chewing metal. This isn't over, Hayes. No, Connor agreed, but it's not secret anymore either. And that changes everything. The human fleet began to pull back, slowly, reluctantly. But moving away from immediate confrontation, from the kind of engagement that would look indefensible with billions watching across multiple species networks. When they were gone, the moon felt quieter, lighter, like pressure had released that Connor hadn't fully registered until its absence. Raisen approached them both, expression still unreadable. You stood alone against your species, she said to Connor. I stood for what was right, he corrected. She turned to Seraph. The bond stands, not because of law, but because you both chose consequence over convenience. Then she looked between them, ancient eyes seeing patterns that transcended immediate crisis. You are no longer merely human, she told Connor. You are witnessed, known. Your name will spread across Kael'thar space as the first of your kind to value honor over species loyalty. Connor swallowed hard. Does that come with benefits or just a larger target? Raisen allowed the faintest smile, the expression transforming her features from stern arbiter to something almost warm. Both, always both. She addressed them formally. The final choice remains. Seraph, you claimed this human. Do you maintain that claim? Knowing the cause, knowing that both our peoples will question this bond? Seraph faced Connor, not as warrior to civilian, not as alien to human, but as someone who'd almost died alone addressing the person who'd refused to let that happen. I claimed him in desperation, she said. I claim him now in choice. Tal'Kareth stands. Raisen turned to Connor. And you, Connor Hayes, Seraph has bound herself to you. Will you accept? Understanding this is not human marriage, not ownership, but partnership that demands truth and loyalty above all else? Connor looked at the warrior who'd declared him worthy when his own people had declared him expendable. At the person who'd stood with him when standing meant facing species-level consequences. I choose to stand, he said clearly, with her, for her, whatever that means. Seraph reached for his hand. This time he didn't hesitate. Her fingers closed around his, grip firm and steady, the gesture carrying weight that transcended physical contact. The bond didn't burn, didn't glow or tear reality apart the way Connor had half expected. It settled, warm and heavy and real, like something fundamental clicking into place, like architecture that had been waiting for the final support beam before becoming stable. The Kael'thar warriors present touched fist to chest, the gesture of acknowledgement, of witnessing something that mattered. Rhys-Andy nodded once, satisfied. The choice is witnessed. The bond is accepted. Now, her expression hardened slightly, comes the complicated part, where we determine what this partnership means for the future neither species planned. Connor looked up at the ships in orbit, at the political storm they'd just triggered, at the uncertain path stretching ahead. Then he looked at Seraph, who met his eyes with fierce certainty. For the first time since the convoy had exploded around him, Connor felt like he'd made a choice that actually mattered. Not survival, not convenience, but something that might reshape how species looked at each other if they were brave enough to let it. The consequences were coming, enormous and unavoidable. But for now, standing on barren moon with an alien warrior's hand in his, Connor Hayes felt like he'd finally stopped running from the future and started building one worth reaching. The Kael'thar flagship didn't feel like a ship. Connor had been on military vessels before, all harsh angles and utilitarian corridors designed by engineers who measured success in maximum efficiency per cubic meter. This was different. The walls curved like living things, bioluminescent veins pulsing with soft light that responded to movement, to presence, to intention he couldn't begin to measure. The architecture felt grown rather than built, organic technology that made the distinction between machine and organism meaningless. But before they had even boarded, there had been 6 hours in the medical bay. 6 hours watching alien physicians work on Seraph with technology that looked like sculpture and functioned like miracles. They'd regrown tissue, realigned her biology's natural crystalline patterns, accelerated healing through methods he tried to understand and failed completely. She'd been unconscious through most of it, her body surrendering to treatment only after node power expenditure had pushed her past the point where pride could sustain consciousness. The physicians had explained through translators that using ancient nodes without proper preparation was like running marathon on broken legs, possible through sheer will, catastrophic for recovery. Connor had stayed, watched, learned what he could about KL biology from observation and desperate questions. Because if they were bound, he needed to understand how to keep her alive when the next crisis came. And there would be a next crisis. That much was guaranteed. Now, walking beside Seraph through corridors that seemed to shift subtly as they passed, the ship itself making room for them, Connor saw her transformed. Her wounds had closed to silver scars. Her armor had been replaced, new war plate fitted to her frame with the precision of custom tailoring. She looked like what she was again. Warbound, commander, dangerous. But she stayed at his side instead of walking ahead, the subtle positioning speaking volumes about how she saw their relationship. Partnership, not protection detail. The council chamber is ahead, she said quietly. They will ask difficult questions. How difficult are we talking? Connor adjusted the formal jacket that Thar had provided, designed for human proportions but styled in their aesthetic. He felt like he was wearing someone else's authority. They will question whether you manipulated me, whether the bond is genuine or tactical deception. Seraph's expression remained calm, but her voice carried tension. They will question whether humanity can be trusted based on your actions alone. And if I give the wrong answer? There are no wrong answers, only honest ones and lies. She touched his arm briefly. Stay honest. That is the only strategy that matters here. The corridor opened into a chamber that made Connor's breath catch. 7 platforms arranged in a circle, each one occupied by a Thar arbiter who radiated the kind of presence that came from decades of command and centuries of cultural weight. Above them, the ceiling showed stars, real-time feed of the space surrounding the flagship. To the sides, holographic projections displayed galleries filled with witnesses, both Thar and human, billions watching across light years of distance. This wasn't a private judgment. This was theater. Statement. The trial that would define how 2 species looked at each other for generations. Seraph walked to the center of the circle and stood with military precision, spine straight, hands at her sides. Connor joined her, less graceful, but trying to match her composure. Ryson occupied the central platform, her indigo eyes sweeping across them both before addressing the assembly. We gather to judge Talkareth claimed between species, between Cormara Seraph of the Starborn Vanguard and Connor Hayes of Earth. Her voice carried to every corner without amplification. The charges are threefold. First, Seraph, you are accused of unauthorized mate bond with species deemed inferior by covenant law. Second, Connor Hayes, you are accused of interference in Thar sovereignty through manipulation of our sacred customs. Third, both are accused of exposing classified operations that endangered both our peoples. Another arbiter spoke, male, his armor marked with military honors that covered every available surface. Arbiter Kao, if Connor remembered Seraph's brief cultural lessons correctly. Cormara Seraph, you have brought shame to your lineage. Claiming a human as mate, as equal? This insults everything our warriors represent. Seraph's voice cut back without hesitation. I claimed a warrior who saved my life. His species is irrelevant to his worth. Worth? Kale's laugh was sharp. He is human. They orchestrated your death. They manipulate and scheme while we face enemies with honor. We manipulated as well, Seraph replied, and silence crashed across the chamber like a physical force. Or have you forgotten? The council knew of Earth's plans, voted to allow my sacrifice. 4-3, I am told. Gasps rippled through the watching galleries. This was information the general population hadn't known. Truth that recontextualized everything. A female arbiter spoke next, her tone more measured. Arbiter lies, scholar rather than soldier from her bearing. The tactical necessity of that vote is complex, Cormara. We believed losing one warrior could prevent losing millions in civil war. You believed wrong, Seraph said flatly, because you forgot that individuals matter. That honor means nothing if we sacrifice our own for political convenience. Rysen raised one hand, silence falling immediately. Connor Hayes, you have heard the charges. Speak to them. Connor stepped forward slightly, acutely aware of billions of eyes on him, human and alien alike. Every word would be analyzed, dissected, turned into evidence for positions already decided. Stay honest, Seraph had said. Only strategy that matters. I didn't manipulate anyone, he began, voice carrying despite his nerves. I saw someone dying. I helped. That's not strategy. That's just being human. He paused. Being decent, I mean. Not being my species. Being the kind of person I want to be. Arbiter Kyle leaned forward. And when she claimed you, when she bound herself, you accepted this knowing it would create political crisis? I accepted it because she chose me, Connor replied. Because someone finally looked at me and saw worth instead of utility. Because I was tired of being treated like ammunition by people who measure lives in acceptable losses. Pretty words, Kale said dismissively. Your species excels at those while plotting betrayal. Connor felt anger flash hot. My species also excels at innovation, at survival, at refusing to stay in boxes you build for us. Yeah, some of us are manipulative bastards. Some of us also choose different paths. You chose to expose classified operations, another arbiter interjected. Released information that endangered ongoing negotiations, that revealed intelligence sources, that gave our enemies insight into our capabilities. I exposed a conspiracy, Connor corrected. I gave both our peoples the truth about governments willing to sacrifice citizens for political gain. If that endangered operations, maybe those operations deserved exposure. Rysen's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held something that might have been approval. Both governments planned this scenario, she said, addressing the full assembly now. Earth Strategic Command and elements of our own council. They used our laws, our customs, our people as pieces in games played for power rather than survival. She gestured and holographic displays materialized, showing the files Connor had broadcast. Project Catalyst in all its detailed manipulation. The vote records from the Kale Thar Council, financial trails, communication logs, everything. Connor Hayes acted when we, with all our accumulated wisdom, chose politics over principle, Rysen continued. He shames us. He shames his own leaders. He forces us to confront what we became while pretending to be honorable. Arbiter Kale stood abruptly. You defend this human? This? I defend truth, Rysen interrupted, her voice carrying absolute authority. Something we claim to value while avoiding it when convenient. She turned to Seraph. You claim Talcareth. Explain why we should accept a bond that fractures tradition. Seraph drew herself up, and Connor saw the warrior leader she'd been before injury and conspiracy had reduced her to survival mode. I claimed him because he remembered what we forgot, she said, voice ringing clear. That strength without compassion is just violence. That honor measured only in victory is hollow. That choosing right action matters more than choosing convenient action. She looked directly at Arbiter Kale. You call him inferior. But when I was dying, when both our peoples had written me off as acceptable loss, he intervened. Not for reward, not for status, because it was right. Seraph's gaze swept the council. If that makes him inferior, then we have measured worth incorrectly for centuries. Murmurs rippled through the galleries, debate erupting in dozens of languages. Rysen allowed it for a moment, then raised her hand again. Connor Hayes, final question. Why should we trust your species when your governments conspire? Connor took a breath, knowing this answer would define everything that followed. You shouldn't, he said bluntly. Not blindly, not without verification. But you shouldn't trust your own government blindly either. He gestured to the displayed evidence. Both sides proved they'll sacrifice individuals for power. Both sides lied. Both sides treated people like tools. He looked at Seraph, then back to the council. Maybe the question isn't which species to trust. Maybe it's which individuals prove they deserve it through action instead of words, through choosing principle over convenience, even when it costs everything. Silence fell, heavy with consideration. Then Arbiter Lace spoke, her tone thoughtful. You propose we judge by individual merit rather than species loyalty. I propose we start somewhere, Connor replied. Build trust through transparency and choice. Prove cooperation is possible before demanding blind faith. And if you fail, KL demanded, if this bond collapses, if you prove unworthy, Connor met the arbiter's hostile gaze without flinching. Then judge me for my failures, not my species, not Seraph for choosing me, just me. That is not how our law works. Then maybe your law needs updating, Connor interrupted, immediately regretting his bluntness but unable to stop the words. Because treating individuals as representatives of entire species is how we got here, how both our governments justified using us as pawns. Arbiter Kale's expression darkened dangerously. Rysen stood, commanding immediate attention. The council will deliberate. Seraph and Connor Hayes will wait. The platforms dimmed, the arbiters entering private conference that excluded everyone else. Connor and Seraph stood in the center of the circle, watched by billions, waiting for judgment that would reshape their lives and potentially their species' relationship. Seraph leaned close, voice barely audible. You challenged an arbiter directly. That was bold. Was it stupid? Connor asked quietly. Stupid would have been lying. Bold means you might survive being right. She almost smiled. I am uncertain which outcome is better for your health. Time stretched. Connor watched the galleries, seeing debates raging in real time across species barriers. Some humans supported him. Others called for his arrest as traitor. Some Kyle Thar praised Seraph's honor. Others demanded her censure for breaking tradition. The universe was dividing along lines that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with whether people valued principle or power. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the platforms brightened. The arbiters had decided. Racine spoke first. We have reviewed evidence. We have weighed testimony. We have considered precedent and consequence. She paused, the silence carrying enormous weight. The vote is 4-3. The Talcareth bond is accepted. Connor's knees nearly buckled with relief. Beside him, Seraph remained rigidly upright, but he felt her hand brush against his, brief contact that carried profound emotion. However, Racine continued, and Connor's relief evaporated. Acceptance comes with conditions and consequences. She addressed Seraph directly. You claimed bond that fractures political stability. You expose conspiracy that humiliates our leadership. You have created unprecedented situation. I understand, Arbiter. I do not believe you do, Racine replied, but her tone wasn't harsh. You and Connor Hayes have become symbols, evidence that species cooperation is possible, that individual choice can matter more than institutional directive. She gestured and new holographic displays appeared, showing news feeds from both Earth and Kelthar space. Protests, demonstrations, some calling for the bond to be dissolved, others celebrating it as breakthrough. You have started conversation neither government wanted, Racine said, made visible what should have remained hidden, given populations reason to question authority. Arbiter Lai spoke next. The council debated your punishment. Some argued for dissolution of bond, reassignment of Seraph to remote posting, return of Connor Hayes to Earth custody. Connor's stomach dropped. We rejected those proposals, Liz continued, because they would prove the worst accusations correct, that we value control over principle. Arbiter Kale spoke grudgingly. Instead, we assign you responsibility equal to your disruption. You will become what you accidentally created, bridge between species. Evidence that cooperation is possible. Rysen's expression hardened. Connor Hayes and Cormara Seraph, you are hereby designated as Corshale, bridge walkers, first official human Kael'thar partnership. But there is condition you will not anticipate. Connor's stomach dropped further. What condition? You must return to Earth. Rysen let that sink in. As official Kael'thar representatives, Connor Hayes, you will represent the people who tried to kill you. You will negotiate for the species that marked you expendable. You will stand in halls of power and argue for cooperation with those who conspired against you. The cruelty of it hit like physical blow. Not exile, not escape. Return. Facing them with authority they couldn't ignore, but desperately wanted to eliminate. Seraph's hand found his. We faced them together. Connor swallowed hard. That's, that's actually terrifying. Yes, Risen agreed. That is why it will work. They cannot silence you without proving every accusation true, cannot eliminate you without showing their own population they value power over principle. Your existence becomes their accountability. She outlined the full terms with clinical precision. Connor and Seraph would operate from neutral territory initially, newly established station between Earth and Kael'thar space. They would mediate disputes, investigate violations of the fragile peace, represent possibility of alliance to populations still hostile. But within 6 months, they would return to Earth as official diplomatic presence. Extremists from both species would target them. Assassinations would be attempted. Political pressure would be constant. Success was uncertain. Survival was questionable. Do you accept these terms? Risen asked formally. Seraph looked at Connor, the question clear in her eyes. Your choice. Our choice. Connor thought about the convoy burning around him, about pulling Seraph from certain death, about exposing conspiracies that would have consumed them both, about every choice that had led to this moment where he stood before alien judges being offered a future he'd never imagined. He could refuse, return to Earth alone, disappear into obscurity, try to rebuild the quiet life he'd lost. But he'd already learned that lesson. Quiet meant complicit. Invisible meant ineffective. We accept, he said, and felt Seraph's approval like warmth. We accept, she echoed, voice carrying certainty. Risen allowed herself a small smile. Then let it be witnessed. The bond stands. The partnership begins. May you prove worthy of the chaos you have created. She paused. And we have received communication from Earth Military Command. Captain Brenna Cordell has been placed under arrest, pending investigation into Project Catalyst. She is cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Connor felt complicated emotions, relief that accountability existed, sadness that it required conspiracy exposure rather than internal integrity. She was following orders, he said quietly. As were the guards at every historical atrocity, Risen replied. Orders do not absolve choice. She is learning that cost. The formal proceedings dissolved into administrative details. Living arrangements on the neutral station, security protocols, communication channels with both governments, the overwhelming bureaucracy of building something new from nothing. Through it all, Connor stayed close to Seraph, their partnership no longer questioned, but now official, recognized, carrying weight that transcended personal connection. As they left the council chamber, moving through corridors toward the transport that would take them to their new posting, Seraph spoke quietly. Are you afraid? Connor considered lying, offering brave confidence, chose honesty instead. Terrified, we just painted targets on ourselves big enough to see from orbit. Yes, Seraph agreed, but we painted them together. That's supposed to be comforting? She almost smiled. It means when they shoot, we can push each other out of the way. Take turns being target. Connor laughed despite the situation, the sound carrying genuine humor. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Romance is not Talkareth's purpose. What is? Seraph stopped, turning to face him fully. Partnership. Truth. Choosing each other when choosing alone would be safer. She placed her hand over her chest, the gesture formal and sacred. Talkareth and Korala, until stars fade. Connor mirrored the gesture, feeling the weight of words he didn't fully understand but meant completely. Until stars fade. 2 weeks later, the neutral station designated Bridges End hung in the darkness between territories, neither Earth nor Kael'thar claiming sovereignty, both watching with suspicion and hope in equal measure. Connor stood in the training room, breathing hard, body aching from another session, learning Kael'thar combat techniques. He was terrible at it, reflexes too slow, instincts wrong for their style of flowing precision. But he was improving, slowly, painfully, but measurably. Seraph circled him with the patience of someone who'd taught hundreds of students and knew the difference between inability and learning curve. Your form is still awful, she observed, blade arm extended in demonstration position. Connor wiped sweat from his face, grinning despite exhaustion. Your teaching method is sadistic. It keeps you alive. That is the only metric that matters. She moved again, the training sequence designed to build muscle memory through repetition. Connor followed, stumbling, but determined. They'd fallen into rhythm over the past 2 weeks. Seraph led diplomatic negotiations, her presence commanding immediate respect from KLTHAR representatives and forcing human delegators to reconsider assumptions. Connor handled technical problems, cultural translation, the thousand small details that made cooperation possible. And they'd survived their first real test together. It had happened 6 days ago. Human extremists, forged credentials, plasma charge hidden in diplomatic gift basket. Seraph had sensed wrong intention. Through cultural reading, Connor still didn't understand, moved with inhuman speed, taken the blast meant for him. She'd nearly died. Again. Third time since they'd met. Connor had saved her. Again. Using KLTHAR medical techniques, he'd spent 72 sleepless hours learning from database files and desperate improvisation, applying crystalline regeneration stimulation to her damaged patterns, using electromagnetic pulses at frequencies that promoted cellular reconstruction in her species. Where even now, he'd joked when she regained consciousness, sitting beside her medical bed with hands still shaking from adrenaline crash. Talcareth doesn't balance, Seraph had replied, voice weak but certain. It accumulates. We keep saving each other until saving becomes unnecessary. Or impossible, Connor had added quietly. Or impossible, she'd agreed. Now, training together in the quiet of Bridge's End, Connor felt the weight of what they'd built. Not perfect, not easy, but real. A partnership that had started in blood and desperation and had somehow transformed into something that mattered beyond either of them individually. Break, Seraph called, lowering her blade arm. Connor collapsed onto a bench, breathing hard. She joined him, close enough that their shoulders touched, comfortable with proximity that had developed gradually. Outside the training room's viewport, Earth's sun was visible as a brighter point to one side, KLTHAR home system constellation pattern visible to the other. Connor found himself staring at both, feeling the weight of existing between two worlds that wanted him to choose sides. You are troubled, Seraph observed, following his gaze. Just thinking, Connor replied, about what we're building, whether it'll last, whether returning to Earth as your representative is brave or just suicide with extra steps. Seraph was quiet for a long moment, her own eyes on the distant stars. It will last as long as we choose to maintain it, she said finally, voice carrying the pragmatic certainty he'd come to rely on. Beyond that is not our responsibility. She turned to him fully. Do you regret it? Being bound to me? All the complications? The assassination attempt? The knowledge that we'll face worse when we return to Earth? Connor met her violet eyes, seeing genuine concern there, despite her warrior stoicism. I regret that my species tried to kill me, that yours voted to let you die. He reached over and took her hand, the gesture natural now. I don't regret claiming the bond, don't regret standing with you, don't regret any choice that led here. Even knowing we face assassination attempts, political pressure, extremists from both sides? Especially because of that. Connor smiled faintly. Someone has to prove cooperation is possible. Someone has to show that individuals can choose differently than their governments. Might as well be us. Seraph studied his face, searching for doubt, for regret, for the cracks that would signal their partnership was built on desperation rather than genuine commitment. She found none. You truly believe this can work, she said, not quite a question. I believe we can make it work, Connor corrected. I believe that's all anyone can do. Make the choice daily to build something better than what came before, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Seraph's expression softened, the transformation subtle but profound. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture of trust earned over 2 weeks of partnership, of watching each other's backs, of choosing transparency over convenient deception. Talcareth sin kor Allah, she said softly, the ritual phrase carrying new weight. Until stars fade, Connor replied, meaning it more with each repetition. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the space between their peoples. The distance they were slowly bridging through stubbornness and choice in refusal to accept that species division was inevitable. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of story that ended in explosive triumph or tragic sacrifice. It was just two people from different worlds, different biologies, different cultures, choosing each other over and over again. Choosing honesty when lies would be easier. Choosing partnership when isolation would be safer. Choosing to believe that change started with individual actions, not grand proclamations. Behind them, the station hummed with activity. Diplomatic meetings scheduled for tomorrow. Trade negotiations next week. Cultural exchanges being planned. All the mundane work of building peace one careful agreement at a time. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but possible. And in a universe that had grown comfortable with division and suspicion, possibility mattered more than certainty ever could. Connor thought about the convoy burning, about foam seal and desperate improvisation, about pulling a dying warrior from certain death without knowing her name or importance. He'd saved her because it was right. She'd claimed him because he'd proven worthy. Now they built something together that neither could have created alone. Not peace, not yet, maybe never. But the foundation for it, the proof that it could exist, the demonstration that when individuals chose principle over convenience, when they valued each other's lives over species loyalty, when they refused to let their governments define the limits of cooperation, things changed. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and resistance and genuine danger. But they changed. Seraph straightened, pulling back to look at him directly. Her hand came up to rest against his cheek. The gesture she'd used in the pod when claiming him, now transformed from desperate declaration into gentle affection. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not leaving me to die honorably." Her lips curved slightly. "For being foolish enough to intervene. For staying foolish enough to keep choosing me despite every logical reason to walk away." Connor laughed softly. "Thank you for being worth the foolishness. For claiming someone who had no idea what he was getting into. For trusting me with your life when your entire culture said humans weren't trustworthy." "You proved them wrong," Seraph said. "Daily, you continue proving them wrong." "We prove them wrong," Connor corrected. "Together. That's the whole point, isn't it? That neither of us has to be perfect alone because we're building something together." Seraph's expression shifted to something fierce and proud. "Yes, that is exactly the point. That is what terrifies them. Not that individuals might be noble, that individuals might choose each other across every boundary they built to keep us separate." She pressed her hand to his chest over his heart, the formal gesture of her people that had become their private ritual. "You chose right action. I chose you. Together, we choose what comes next. Every day, every challenge, every attempt to force us back into the boxes they built." Connor covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. The proof that they'd both survived when survival had seemed impossible. "Together," he agreed, "whatever that looks like, whatever it costs, however long it takes." Outside the viewport, the stars turned in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on space stations and negotiation tables. But the people who watched those stars, human and Kael'thar alike, were changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Because two individuals had chosen each other over species loyalty, had chosen truth over convenient lies, had chosen partnership when isolation would have been safer. And that choice, repeated daily, witnessed by billions, was beginning to reshape how the universe looked at the space between different kinds of consciousness, was beginning to prove that bonds could cross any distance if both parties chose to maintain them, was beginning to build something that might last beyond the individuals who started it, or it might fail spectacularly. But either way, Connor Hayes and Seraph Kale would face the outcome together, choosing each other, choosing honor, choosing the hard work of building peace through example rather than demanding it through force, until stars fade, until the choice no longer needed making, until partnership became so natural that no one remembered when it had seemed impossible. They stood, returning to training, to preparation, to the practical work of ensuring they'd survive whatever came next, because words and ideals only mattered if you lived long enough to make them real. Seraph moved through the combat forms, Connor following with improving coordination. Their movements synchronized gradually, the physical echo of partnership built on mutual trust and shared purpose. This was the work. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but daily practice, daily choice, daily commitment to being worthy of what they'd claimed. The story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. And that beginning, imperfect and uncertain and absolutely real, was enough.